How's it going out there? This is the Otherppl Show. I'm Brad Listi in Los Angeles. It is good to be with you. I hope you're doing all right. I have a great episode for you, another flashback episode. It is Friday. I hope you had a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. So the flashback today comes from the deep archives. Episode 107, all the way back in 2012, a conversation that I had with D.T. Max, who is a longtime staff writer for the New Yorker magazine and the author of several books, including The Family That Couldn't Sleep, A Medical Mystery, another book called Finale, Late Conversations with Stephen Sondheim, and most germane to today's episode, a biography of David Foster Wallace called Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, which published back in 2012. I met D.T. Max back then. I was living in my old apartment. And he came to my place and we sat down and we talked about David Foster Wallace. And I remember loving the book when I read it and really enjoying the conversation. I have to believe this was the first biography. I think I have that right. The first biography of David Foster Wallace. If it wasn't the first, it was close. So you're going to hear an outtake from that conversation momentarily. A quick reminder to please sign up for my email newsletter. It goes out once a week. I'd love it if you would sign up. You can do so for free at otherppl.com or bradlisti.com. Likewise, I would love it if you would support this show. This is a listener-supported show. If you love the Otherppl podcast, you can support it over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. You can get stuff too. A sticker, a coffee mug, that kind of thing, over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. So once again, I'm going to be doing a flashback episode today from episode 107, which first aired on September 22nd, 2012. A conversation with author D.T. Max. We were talking about his book entitled Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, A Life of David Foster Wallace, who is obviously the central subject of our exchange. So here's a bit from that. If you want to listen to the full episode, you can. It is in the feed, episode 107. So this will be an outtake. If you want to hear the full thing, go get it. All right? All right. So here I am with D.T. Max.
You know, so many things surprised me. I had begun the book as a New Yorker piece shortly after David's death in September 2008. And I finished that piece around March. And I thought I learned a lot about David. You know, and it was a long piece. It was 10,000 words. And a lot of people, you know, felt that it really captured David as he was, and especially David as he was in his later years, because a lot of the piece was sort of focused on his inability to finish The Pale King and, you know, his decline from there and his suicide. But it turned out, I mean, that I knew nothing about David. You know, I knew, for instance, absolutely nothing about his relationship with women, which would turn out to be a very big part of his life. I did not know how long he had worked on The Pale King. I had no idea that he started The Pale King, you know, in 1996 or 1997, shortly after he'd written Infinite Jest. I mean, he may have written pieces of it even earlier, but I know he's working on it shortly after Infinite Jest. I had no idea that Infinite Jest itself had been begun when David was a graduate student. I mean, it shocked me. One of the things I found while working on Every Love Story is a Ghost Story is I found his Yaddo file for an application that he made in 1986, and there it is, Infinite Jest. It says tentative title Infinite Jest. I had no idea. I mean, it never occurred to me even working on that project so early. I didn't know that he'd gone on Nardil, which is the antidepressant, which both saved his life and sort of tormented him when he went on it. I didn't know about his difficult relations with his mother, which would include, you know, a difficult period when he's in his early 30s where I went to the Ransom Center archives where a lot of David's papers are kept, and I found some marginalia, some notes that he'd written in copies of books like The Drama of the Gifted Child, where he talks about how his mother has sort of put him on a pedestal. Didn't know any of that stuff. On a more kind of broad level, I don't think I realized how hard it was for David to be David. I don't think I realized how perpetually he suffered. I didn't think I realized how every day he negotiated sort of the terms of his life. These were just things that were beyond the reach of the original article.
Yeah, and then what about your own particular fandom? Are you a fan of David Foster Wallace's writing? Was that what brought you to write the original piece, or was it something that was assigned to you?
Well, I mean, the answer is both. David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker, emailed me. I had been living in Alexandria, Virginia, and I remember that when David died, I must have been in some restaurant or something, because I was watching like MSNBC, and on the zipper, that little sort of line of printed material that goes around, if there's no visual, the story isn't big enough, they put it on the zipper. And the zipper said David Foster Wallace, and that was all I saw. And I thought, oh, goody, David Foster Wallace has finally won an award. He's finally getting the recognition that he deserves. Because I was aware he'd never, David Foster Wallace never won a major or even a minor book award. I mean, it seems bizarre in retrospect, but he never won a Pulitzer, he never won a National Book Award, a National Book Critics Circle Award. I don't actually know if he was even nominated for any of these things when I think about it. Anyway, so I got home and I found out, through the internet what had actually happened, the sad story that he had committed suicide. And, maybe a day or so later, David Remnick emailed me and asked me if I wanted to, to write about what David's last months had been like. And I don't think I had any idea. David was very private. I mean, I now know from the work on the book that part of this privacy was almost kind of obsessional and had to do a lot with not really liking who he was.
Well, and there's also there's an interesting contradiction that he himself articulated, and I'm going to probably mess it up when I paraphrase it, but I think it had something to do with being a private exhibitionist.
Yeah, I'm an exhibitionist who wants to hide.
Right.
But who fails at hiding, therefore I succeed. I think that's what it is. I'm doing that from memory. And then the best part is he then cut that line from the interview. It was so he was and this exhibitionist or not, he still wanted to hide a little bit better than to lay out the roadmap to who he was.
Right. And that was the Larry McCaffrey interview, which is great.
It's the Rosetta Stone interview for David, It's where things start. Well, anyway, so I received that email from David Remnick, and I did want to write about David, and the book that I had loved my whole life. David was were he to be alive, would be 1 year younger than I am, and so he and I are contemporaries. And when David first published The Broom of the System in 1987, his editor, looking for reviews, sent me an advanced reading copy, which I devoured. And over the years, I've reread that book every so often. I think generally when I was just feeling a little bit like I needed just a really good, complicated laugh. There's a line in a letter that David writes he writes this letter to his 12-step sponsor at one point, recalling his own time when when David is in the halfway house, and how he's worried he's going to start drinking and smoking pot again. And he says that that his friend, the AA sponsor, had written to him and saved him from basically failing in his sobriety with what he calls a good MFA caliber trope. Well, Broom of the System was my good MFA caliber trope. Whenever I needed it, there it was. And so I was shocked in working on the New Yorker piece to find out that David disowned the first book, referring to it as something in a letter to Jonathan Franzen. He says it could have been written by a very smart 14-year-old. I mean, now that I think about it, I don't even know that he says very smart. I think he just says a smart 14-year-old. I think it's a great example of how much David undervalued his work, but it's also, I had been having the wrong sort of orgasm all those years, as they say in Manhattan. So, one of the incredible pleasures, what I like as a writer, what I've always liked as a writer, is to learn. So if you look at my work in the New Yorker and the earlier book that I wrote on fatal familial insomnia, and this book, what they all have in common is learning. I don't like to take on a project where I'm already an expert. So one of the great pleasures of writing the book about David is that I got to read things I had maybe read once not so carefully and really get into them. And one of my tests was, for whether this was the kind of book that I wanted to write, one of my tests was like, would I be bored with Infinite Jest by the end? When I'd had to read it 3 times. And
you read it 3 times?
Yeah. And that puts me like I'm a piker compared to some people. I mean, some people 3 times just to get going on it. I mean, you can read it more and you can get more out of it. For me, it was, the happy answer is it wasn't enough. I mean, I could happily have read it another time. I mean, it's just a completely fascinating book, and a book that I grew more deeply into as I was working on Every Love Story as a Ghost Story. And then the really sort of interesting thing from my point of view is I feel a little bit now like I've passed through Infinite Jest, and the book I really want to spend some time with and really get deep into is Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, the short story collection that follows Infinite Jest, and which is in some ways is, the book that, I mean, David, I think in a letter I quote in the biography says that it's a book that's mean to practically everybody you can be mean to. But there's a lot in that book that I don't think I really have picked up yet.
A lot autobiographically?
Oh, no. This isn't professional reading. No, God, no. I mean, I think I've mined that baby fine. No. I mean, a lot about who David was as a creative person. A lot about where he was carrying his project as a fiction writer. I mean, the things that really, really matter.
Yeah. And then what about
which, by the way, puts me on course for oblivion, when I'm sort of in the old age home.
So
or everything and more.
and what about assessing David's intelligence? Because this is something like I think I'm decidedly average by comparison. I think a lot of people, when they pick up David Foster Wallace's books or they read him in interviews, it becomes pretty clear that he's operating at a pretty high level intellectually. But at the same time, I think that there is a possibility that intelligence could be fetishized and maybe overstated or held up as some sort of, ideal, or do you know what I'm saying? Like,
of course.
How do you think of that, having written this book? Like, how do you look at it?
Well, I mean, I think the question can even be made more complicated, which is, is intelligence the most important ingredient when you're writing a novel? And I can adduce on the contrary side no less an authority than Bret Easton Ellis, who has recently become well known for sort of tweets saying that David Foster Wallace has the most overblown reputation since, I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this.
Yeah, since the most overblown reputation since, I don't know, Austin Dobson. I don't really know who to say for the other side of that but Joyce Kilmer. Anyway. But what Bret said earlier, shortly after David died, which I find kind of more intriguing, is he said, I never really read David Wallace with any pleasure. It's possible that he was just too smart to write novels. I find that a more interesting question. There's a part of novel writing is pretty humdrum. I mean, part of novel writing is the orchestration of characters and the movement of these characters, even in a fairly non-standard book like Infinite Jest, the movement of these characters around a kind of a chessboard. And that's really not, I think, the work of a genius. That chess is the work of a genius, or at least a certain kind of genius. I think that, part of what's so interesting about David is, in my heart, what I believe is that David had the wrong kind of intelligence to be a novel writer, but he succeeded as a novel writer anyway because he had so much intelligence, because he was so massively... I mean, I think the stories about how smart David was are true. I mean, it's a little bit... I mean, the thing about intelligence is there are, as we all know now, different kinds of intelligences. But in that certain kind of, historic white lab coat slide rule, faster at the dinner table with the answer, off to the best colleges, graduate work done in fewer hours than other people take to do their graduate work, so that, said individual is already sitting at the bar while the rest of us are still sweating away. There, David really was off the charts. I mean, everything I learned for Every Love Story is a Ghost Story really confirmed that, one, that he was insanely intelligent, and two, that he really worked to be a great student.
Well, see, that was part of it that surprised me, because I knew, having read him, that he was obviously a huge
I can see
mind.
in saying that I may have stumbled off of the straight and narrow, but to me it's not really inconsistent. I mean, he had focus, partially because of his mental difficulties. I don't think anything else felt quite so alive to David as study. Here we're mostly talking about his years as an undergraduate at Amherst, and to a lesser extent a graduate student at Arizona. But what I feel is that you see this intelligence that was really probably better designed for other things, And especially during his years at Amherst. He goes to Amherst, he's lonely, he has 2 breakdowns in short order, becomes a fiction writer, publishes a really, really precocious first story called The Planet Trilithon while still at school. And in the last, 3, 4, 5 months of his time at Amherst, he writes The Broom of the System, this 500-600 page comic work, which to which I owe much of my reading pleasure in my 20s and 30s. But what I was going to say is, I think that where David's fiction is strongest and weakest is sort of still along the seams of that original, somewhat technical intelligence. And for instance, I believe one reason that David, through much of his time, had trouble with issues like plagiarism, most famously when he's working on the story collection Girl with Curious Hair, and one of the stories, the David Letterman story called My Appearance, is about to go to press in magazine form at Playboy, and one of the editors is watching TV and to his amazement discovers that much of the dialogue in My Appearance, which was actually not, it was called Late Night with Letterman, I think, when it was at Playboy. Anyway, much of the dialogue was lifted from an actual interview that Susan St. James, the actress, had given to Letterman. Well, how could a person of David's creativity and imagination have done this? And I think one of the answers is, David was creative without being enormously inventive, and I think that's one of the sort of aspects of his intelligence that I think bears a close examination. In a lot of ways, one of my favorite quotes from the book is the student who is, I think, in one of David's Amherst classes. He teaches briefly at Amherst after he graduates. I think it's Amherst where this takes place. Or maybe it's his first years as a teacher at Illinois State University. And one young woman described the way that they studied fiction together as being like reverse engineering the stories. And I've always thought, there's a lot of truth to that. David, in those sort of unhappy months at home, once he was on leave from Amherst, I think he probably sat there, and I think he, there's a famous story that I guess Joan Didion tells about herself, that she learned to write by typing out Hemingway's stories. Do you know that story?
Yeah. I've actually heard of that from, Hunter Thompson, I want to say, did that with F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Right. Exactly. Those are the two examples that I knew of as well. I think David was just so much brighter than Joan Didion that he didn't have to sit there and type them out. I think it was enough for him to kind of read them over and over with that amazing, isolating, analytic, building blocks kind of mind, that he was able to, figure out in Broom of the System, a novel that was in some ways a lot like everybody else's novels of that genre, most notably Thomas Pynchon, but actually isn't a Pynchon novel. The great sort of rap on The Broom of the System is it's Pynchonian. If you look at the reviews that accompanied that book, and you have to remember we're in 1987 when memories of the 70s are really strong, so that there's a whole generation of critics who are missing, they're missing what once was, which was the era of John Barth and Bartholomew and Pynchon. And they all call it Pynchonian. I've always thought they were wrong, because one of the things that I find so noteworthy about Pynchon, is there's not an ounce of emotion in those books that I can find. And yet actually Lenore Beadsman, the protagonist of The Broom of the System, I find a very emotionally complete woman. And my suspicion, though I certainly don't attempt to prove it in Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, my suspicion is that David must have copied into his brain portraits of emotionally memorable female characters and then written one.
Interesting. Yeah, and just the fact that he went with a female protagonist in his first book, and that choice, I don't know, it's almost, maybe he was just trying to give himself a bigger challenge. It seems like the kind of thing he might have done,
Yeah, although remember he's at the very beginning of his writing career. There is no writing before that, really. So a bigger challenge than what is the question?
Yeah, or just to try to write outside. Who knows? I'm just thinking that it must have been, it seemed like kind of a game to him. Not to reduce it.
Yeah, for sure.
But
the whole premise is a game-like premise.
Right. So, and let's talk, I guess, in like kind of a related way about competition. And this sort of relates not only to his achievements as a student, but I think it also relates to what we were talking about earlier with regard to Bret Easton Ellis, which kind of brought it back into my mind when I watched these guys. I watched Bret making all these comments on his Twitter feed about, Wallace and people who like Wallace. And, there's a lot of kind of like brute criticisms, and some things That personally.
Well, we should mention that for whatever reason he actually liked the biography.
Yeah, we should. We should. Yeah, he said it was an elegantly written.
And he said compassionate.
Yeah. So but there was also
anyway, back to the big point. Yeah.
Well, but there was a line, just to sort of turn this on me a little bit, where he said that there's a whole generation of readers who read David Wallace and congratulate themselves for feeling smart, or something like that.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I sort of winced because I think if I'm being totally sodium pentothal honest, there have been moments where you read Wallace and you do feel better about yourself, or like you learn something, which I don't think is necessarily a terrible thing, but I don't know. It seemed to hit at some degree of truth with regard to like the general adoration out there. I don't know. Yeah, I'm just trying to play fair.
I think it goes so much deeper, though. What I loved about Bret's comments is that it really replicates a war that went on within Wallace himself, which was the battle between irony, and sincerity. So
right.
Bret is kind of like the who I think enjoys this role is almost like the devil standing on David Foster Wallace's shoulder in 1988 or 89, saying like you can still do all these things. You can, first of all, you can still do harmful substances, but metaphorically you can still you can still use irony to cleanse. I think I haven't talked to him about this, but I would think his argument would be that the ironic stance of his novels is more cleansing and sincere and cuts away the garbage and the bullshit in our world in a way that David's, Dudley Do-Right stance, fails to do. That David's stance really covers over insincerities under the sort of, under the rubric of identification, the whole 12-step idea that you identify.
Okay, there we have it. My conversation with D.T. Max in episode 107. D.T. Max is the author of Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, a life of David Foster Wallace. Episode 107 aired on September 22nd, 2012. You can listen to our full conversation wherever you get your podcasts. It's in the feed. Look for episode 107 and hear me talk to D.T. Max. You can find DT Max on the internet. Read his stuff at the New Yorker magazine. You can also follow him on Twitter at DT Max. Don't forget to subscribe to The Otherppl Show wherever you listen. Follow The Otherppl Podcast on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Support the show at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep it going. If you would like to get an Otherppl t-shirt or a sweatshirt, there are different colors, sizes, cuts, men's, women's, children's. Just go to otherppl.com, scroll down, look for the t-shirt. You can't miss it. Click on it. If you have a couple of minutes, I would appreciate it if you would rate this podcast wherever you listen. Write a review if that's an option. It helps the show find new listeners. You can watch the Otherppl Podcast on YouTube. You can't watch the flashback episodes because I wasn't recording video back then, but you can watch the new episodes. If you have feedback for me, the email address is letters@otherppl.com. And finally, a plug for my latest novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. It is out there in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook, so read my book if you want to. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. Okay, so that's it for today. Coming up on Sunday, I will be in conversation with Andrew Lipstein. He has a new novel out called The Vegan, which is pretty incredible. I had a good talk with him, and it's happening soon, so stay tuned.